All right, today we're joined by Mollie Bondenstiener. Mollie, I always have such a great time whenever we get a chance to connect. So glad that you're on the show joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so you've led quite a few teams. I'm going to just kind of give you a brief intro to the audience and to know who you are, because I know you very well, and I would love my audience to know you just as well, if not better. So, um, Mollie's an experienced operations professional with a demonstrated track record of utilizing technology to support operational processes that drive performance and innovation. Most recently, she led global revenue ops, strategy, and planning at Deal. That's DEEL, because I always get confused. Currently runs her own consulting practice, helping organizations further define, implement, and scale revenue operations. She has over 12 years of experience in both B2C and B2B operations and technology. And when she's not working, Mollie enjoys spending time with her husband, three small children, and two large dogs. By the way, what kind of dogs do you have?
I have a Bernese Mountain Dog and a Golden Doodle, so
Oh, you
two
weren't
huge
kidding.
dogs.
You were not kidding. Those are two massive dogs. Do you think they'll be joining us today, or they're kind of tucked away in the bag?
Uh, you'll probably see them wandering around. It depends on if they get hungry or not.
Yeah, I think so. My wife and I, we have a Chihuahua Terrier, so nowhere near the size of your two dogs.
Looks like your dog is probably the size of our Bernese Mountain Dog's paw.
Yeah, my
She's
dog's a snack.
yeah, she's over 100 pounds and just turned one, so it's going to
That's
be an interesting ride with her.
so today I wanted to kind of dive into one of our pillars on the podcast, which is your data should be kind of your source of truth. And so I'd love to not just dive into the data, but really dive into processes to develop a single source of truth. And I know that term is bandied about quite a bit. So I'm going to go a little Webster's on you, provide my definition, then I'd
Perfect.
love to dig into your own definition. So, single source of truth, or SSOTs, some folks might want to put it in the slide. The practice of structuring information models and associated data schemas so that each data element is mastered in only one place, providing data normalization to a canonical form. And so I try to bold some of that in information models, data element only in one place, and canonical form. So that's how I kind of define the source of truth. I'd be curious to see how you think about the processes leading up to that single source of truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, aligning with your definition, like I'm not arguing with your definition, right? I think the way single source of truth gets portrayed around organizations doesn't necessarily follow that, right? It's like everything in one place, exactly where you need it all the time, which isn't how data works, right? Data's fluid, data's changing based on what you're trying to do. Your sources and your systems, you know, aren't always in sync at any point in time, and nor should they be, right? Like that's maybe not actually reality for your business. So part of this, as I think about, just data as a whole, and when we talk about, our single source of truth for data, like you actually need to make sure you're creating the processes to produce the data, right? And this is the part that I think businesses get really hung up on. It's my reporting's wrong, my data's wrong, it's incorrect, but it's actually data is a byproduct of process. So your inputs or your outputs are only as good as your inputs, and your inputs are only as good as your process, your adherence, and like the technology that you've built to generate that data and support that. And so that's where, I think as you're thinking about, what you're trying to do and the reports that you want, right? Everyone's like, oh, I want to see this, I want to see that, I want to see this. How do you actually take a step back from that and build that true data pack that you're hoping to get, right? Your output, and develop the right inputs to generate that. And then that goes into how do we source this? Where do we store it? What does that look like? And how do we actually then extract from, our single source of truth? I'll try not to air quote that too much, but I think you have multiple probably sources of truth potentially based on business.
I think it starts with the query and the questions, right? And then you work
Yep.
back from there. I often think sometimes when you are asked a question, you do not have you have a leaky bucket somewhere
Yep.
across all your plumbing, and you finally go through all your plumbing, get to the fountainhead, and realize there's a leak along the way. Or perhaps your plumbing was just set up incorrectly, right? Like
Yep.
you just realize it's not crisscrossing certain rooms, or the pressure is wrong. So the same thing happens day to day with the systems. I'm curious, some of the more recent classic tensions between sales and marketing, like what's a common framework or question that you've been asked where you had to get two different truths or two different queries together and then work backwards from there to get those two to work together?
Yeah, I think when if we take the example of like the sales and marketing, attribution always becomes like that crux, right? Sales is looking at opportunity source, marketing is looking at like the actual, first touch attribution that potentially generated the record versus the true opportunity. And so, both it's one of those things, it's like they're both not wrong, right? Like, but they're also not right if you're not aligned in how you're reporting and how you're structuring it. And that's ultimately what you need to get at, is the clear definition, and not only the business definition but also the technical definition of how you're going to report on things. And so I think that's just a common example that you run into. Marketing shows up with their numbers, sales shows up with their numbers, and they don't match. Well, their definitions aren't aligned, so not going to match, right? It's obvious, but it's then taking that step backwards and building that alignment and building that consistency and the accountability for how you're going to report.
I always think one of those sweat creating moments is when someone walks in and says, let me look at this report. It's based on create date as opposed to close date. Like, for example, like the conversation around renewal versus retention, they're
Yep.
similar, but they're quite different, right? So, we want to make sure we drill down into the definitions, speak very
Yep.
clearly. I'd be curious about, the importance of maybe alignment or documentation and how you go about building up those processes from the ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the first step is the first step is the conversation, right? It's really building the dialogue and getting that alignment of like, what are we reporting on? What is our standard? What are the key KPIs, the key metrics that are going into our data pack, how we're going to use those. And then making sure, like, once we've got the top level, right? Customer is a great example. We want to know our count of customers. Okay, let's everybody in the room align that we want to know our count of customers. Now the next step is, well, what is a customer? One of the things that I love asking companies I go into is, what's your definition of new versus existing business? Generally, you'll get different answers depending who you're talking to, right? So you want to be really clear on, okay, this is what we want as the top level. Now let's go the step deeper and actually say, what is a customer? How do we define that? What is the true business definition of that? And then what is the process that generates the output that indicates that somebody is a customer? Is it, the one stage on the opportunity that then goes back? Is it a unique ID that comes in from product? How do we know that they're active versus inactive or churned? And that goes into the whole definition of the funnel, but like taking those steps down to really solidify and then document that definition. And then the other piece of this is publishing that definition. So whenever I'd go into a QBR or like an OKR review, anywhere that you're presenting the metrics, having your table of contents on those metrics too. So it's, again, very clear what it means at any point in time, or making sure you've got your data dictionary handy.
Absolutely. So, when all that, right, like I'd be curious about the difference in reception of these processes, these data dictionaries
Yep.
from like your executives down to your front line. Like, how do those two audiences tend to perceive, these new processes and the data dictionary? Because I find that personally, the executives don't have enough time to kind of go through all maybe the pre-read or the post-read,
Yeah.
and in the meeting to pause and make sure that you're aligned on the definition. And then on the front line, sometimes folks are moving so fast they just kind of forget the rules of the road, especially when they're updating the CRM.
Yeah, and I think that's, I generally, if I'm doing, DBT definitions, not expecting the CEO to go in there and confirm and check that, right? So making sure, if I'm presenting in a slide deck, consistently having the one slide that's got kind of everything in there, not expecting them to go in and read the SQL query that's producing it, but giving them enough context so that they know what it is. And again, consistency after you have that alignment. I would tell you that if your C level is not willing to sit in a room and align on core business definitions, they probably shouldn't be in your C level. Because if they're ultimately accountable for what they're reporting back to your board or investors or advisors, they should probably know what you're considering a customer and what you're considering, NRR, NDR, any of the key metrics, CAC, right? They should be able to explain those metrics and what goes into them. So they should be a part of signing off on them.
I find it inspiring when leaders are able to dig in, define the metric for what it is, and all the little intricacies behind the scenes, and it cascades down to the rest of the
Yeah.
organization, and it signals a level of seriousness of how to
Right.
make sure that these metrics are embedded in your day to day. So
And
with
it's not
that,
like we're talking about hundreds of metrics, right? Like you really probably have 10 core operating metrics at the end of the day. So like get those right and then everything should stem from those.
yeah, when you think about these dashboards, like for example, I'm going to get a little bit into the
Yeah.
byproduct, these good processes, the data, and more importantly than the data, the insights. Curious to hear, when you think about the different levels in your org, how do you present the data or the insights? Are you signaling the same metrics to each level of the org, or kind of presenting a panoply of data depending on the audience that you're looking at?
I think it depends on the audience you're looking at, right? Everything pretty well stems from those beginning metrics, but when you look at kind of what is data supposed to do, right? Data is supposed to tell a story, it's supposed to ultimately drive behavior and action. You should either keep doing something or do something different, kind of based on what you're trying to adjust in the data and move, right? Or dials, levers, all that good stuff. So, if I'm looking at presenting something to an SDR leader, what am I actually presenting, right? What is the behavior that I'm trying to drive? I'm probably looking at, what is pipeline, how's your team producing pipeline, not I care about how much pipeline they're producing, but I care also about how are they producing the pipeline, and understanding the how lets me figure out what can we do to adjust that and improve that, or see what's working or not working. So you're going into different levels of detail, like the further you go down, because that's where the more tactical decisions are being made and outputs and actions come from.
That's great. So beyond the pipeline, I always think about the unlock down the road, which is
Yep.
truly the revenue or the bookings that you're bringing in.
Yep.
How does that mixture of product or process and governance and those definitions, how does that unlock the end goal, which is higher quality revenue?
I think one of the big things is consistency, right? So, like, I know we talk fuzzy data can still show trends, right? But like consistent data month over month, like, actually is really what gives you that narrative and lets you truly see performance management. I think one of the hardest things is if you're constantly changing your definitions and constantly pivoting kind of your KPIs and what you're measuring against, it's really hard to scale and build repetition in things that are working and test against that repetition to then further optimize, right? And so I think that's one of the big things when you think about like process. Process should be fluid, process can adjust, but like you still should have some level of like core understanding. Like you shouldn't be changing your fundamental MQL definition every month, because then you're not going to have historical data.
I think it creates too much thrash as well, right? So
Yeah.
your SDR organization has to be able to understand, what their activity metrics, their baseline should be in order to set
Hmm.
up, qualified meeting. How do you define that qualified meeting? How do you know what's best in class? If you change the underlying, personas or targets or even the metrics, then you potentially are rewriting kind of the starting point, the starting line for your organization.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about you know partnering with maybe enablement. You provide the metrics to management and enablement. Now that you have the data, the better because due to the process. How does that cascade across to kind of your enablement partners so that they're able to use the data to then diagnose and specifically coach the business, or at least change a couple of things here and there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially pending where enablement truly sits within your organization, you should have that close partnership, and, they should be working then with the frontline managers and leaders to say like, hey, here's what we're seeing. Here's how it's trending. Like, here's what we should implement to adjust, right? And starting to refine more of like the execution or the tactics that you're applying, and having then those baselines to go back to. And again, I think enablement gets really, really squishy, because there's so many different components of enablement versus like, do you actually have, a data analyst that's working with the team too to help drive kind of some of those insights and behaviors as well. So for the audience, like even if you don't have enablement, right, who can help tell that story and help brainstorm and help measure against what you're trying to change?
Now, with the data itself, I'm thinking through the culture of either self-serve or working through an intermediary like a revenue ops,
Hmm.
sales ops organization. How do you approach developing kind of the self-serve culture, building reporting,
Yeah.
RevOps team? Like, how do you think about servicing the customer about with that balance?
Yeah, I have a pretty firm take on this, and it's not that I won't be flexible, but I don't think RevOps should be building Salesforce reports, right? I think that there's Salesforce reports that RevOps like can build based on the complexity, right? If you're trying to do, different object joins or cross filters or doing different formulas that might be outside of the scope of what maybe your sales leadership can do. But what I like to do is, again, you come in, you define those metrics that you're looking to measure, you're setting up kind of that core data pack, that dashboard that you can have in Salesforce. Again, hot take, Salesforce sometimes isn't great for reporting based on what you're trying to report on, and you might need to use a different BI tool that joins Salesforce data with ERP or service data or product usage that doesn't sit in Salesforce, right? So again, Salesforce isn't great for historicals. I think we all know that, but probably a different conversation. But I like to build kind of baseline templates, right? So like if you've set Salesforce up the right way or CRM up the right way, leaders can use the hierarchy, see what they need to see, but should be empowered to modify based on their needs. And that's where having good CRM hygiene, so making sure you're using the help text and the descriptions on field so they know what things mean when it's squishy, come into play so they can actually self-service, right? And that's where I think giving them the information that they need, the definitions that they need, and kind of the framework allows them to be able to build their reports. When I was at Deal and we had 1,000 plus Salesforce users, I could just build Salesforce reports all day. Like that would be a full time job. And it's better to empower your users to self service, be able to manage themselves. But before they can do that, they actually have to understand the process and the data.
Now, with that, I keep thinking through partnering with a data science or a data
Yep.
org. Have you found yourself in a position where you had a partner that abstracted away from specific systems, just focused on the quality of data? What was your interaction with those orgs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked with a really great data analytics, insights, engineering team. They were kind of, when you talk about those different terms, right, they were a data team. So not only did they have, our data engineers that are actually producing data products and moving things apart, but also had, the analyst within the org and understood kind of what does the data mean, how does it represent. And so building relationships with them was key because ultimately they help produce kind of the outputs, the visualizations, but then also could help support the business in terms of what are we seeing, what's the narrative, and helping to tell the story behind it. And I know, those orgs, I've not worked in a company where that org has always been the same. So sometimes you get really far on like the data product and engineering, and they're like, no, my job is just to move data. And sometimes you get really far on the I'm an analyst, but don't actually know how to produce the data. So it's getting that good mix of kind of that team structure that can work together and really complement each other.
Yeah, I think the larger the organization, the more fragmentation you potentially see.
Yep.
So you're one, maybe two orgs removed, and so relationship building becomes paramount. Making sure that you
Yep.
can influence without authority, and being able to clearly define the business goal and identify, how do we work with this other group who may have competing priorities internally. And I think
Yep.
that's a tough one.
One of my favorite questions to ask, and I'm curious on your take on this because I've gotten into maybe pickles before, but like who owns data, right? So who owns the data in a company?
Yeah, well, the way I think about it is ultimately the business owner. In this case, it could be the chief revenue officer, and then by delegation, probably their appropriate sales managers. Depends
Yep.
on the query. If it's the customer data, existing data, then I think it's owned by the CX organization because they need to have kind of high level of verifiable truth in how they describe their customer, and that goes beyond just simple the account and company data. You're looking at their product usage metrics.
Yep.
You're looking at the conversations that are happening at the business review level. You're looking at their support and how they were able to be serviced by the organization. So the way I think about the data, it's owned by the business owner, and there are different portions of business ownership across all these different teams. And so when we're thinking about these structures, we want to make sure that we have a core data set at the foundational level, and then the ability to answer different queries at the edge where that you're still sourcing from the same data model.
Yeah.
Then there's some signals that get mixed though, because there are a lot of business terms that kind of sound similar to one another, like retention renewal is the one I think of most often. MQL versus regular leads. These are the metrics that can be conflated quite often, and so a lot of coordination at the leadership level needs to be discussed. And what helps there, in my opinion, is to put an end-to-end journey and all
Mhm.
your different stops along the way, and then your conversion rates, and you annotate, what's the metric and what are the different flavors of those metrics that different folks might pepper in to different meetings. And so there's a quite a bit of calibration that has to happen across the entire org.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's I like the business owner owns the data, right? And I think I've been in situations where they're like, "No, RevOps owns the data." And my response back to that is like, I absolutely own making sure that we're producing the right quality of data and the right output of data, meaning that, based on the normalization, the governance standards, how we need to make sure things are hygiened comes out through what we're building, but I don't actually own said data.
I agree with you. I think RevOps is on the hook for the processes and
Yep.
shepherding the definitions, and then getting the systems to work together with one another, making it interoperable, allowing it to sync at
Yep.
the appropriate time, and then communicating those data and those insights out to the business partners. But ultimately, the decisions and the actions, that's not just RevOps alone working in a vacuum. You have to
Right.
work with your stakeholders.
Yeah, it's like I can own the data if you want me to, but I don't think I should, right? And so I know I've had rounds and rounds of those conversations before, so I appreciate your feedback on that.
Yeah. Every single time. I think you ran a segment before I joined you, so you're obviously as a qualified host. So anytime we get to do this, we've got to turn the tables on me and you ask me questions.
I know. I'm like, I gotta take advantage of picking your brain too.
Yeah, let's do it. So before we end off here, I would love to get one or two golden nuggets. What do you wish you knew back then? What you know now in your career? I'd be curious if you go back 15 years in your career, like what would you give advice to yourself, to your younger self?
Yeah, I think a couple of the things that just as I've continued to mature in revenue operations has become more defined, right? One of the things I think a lot about is documentation. There's so much that doesn't get documented well, and like taking the step and taking kind of the pause to document. The average tenure of a RevOps person, I think, is around 15 months within a role. And so you think about, a lot gets done in that time period, a lot can change. And just to the point on like, again, back to data is like, hey, yeah, we made this decision with our MQL on June 1st of 2022. If I leave a company, that knowledge that happened goes with me, and when we start to look at historicals, we don't know why. And so making sure like you put the time, energy, and effort into documentation, and that becomes kind of a guidance of your business, I think is really important from a RevOps perspective. The other thing that I would encourage people to do is understand the data, right? And be okay asking what goes into this, because a lot of times when you're working with somebody who's maybe more technical on the data analytics side, and they're doing the SQL and the pieces that maybe you don't understand, right? It's okay to question what's going into the data model, right? I think especially when things don't look right. I remember working with the data engineer who was pulling all leads in and not excluding converted, right? So we were double counting leads and contacts when we made the joins. Like making sure, like just simple things where they're not going to understand that, but you do understand that system, to make sure you're really working together. So don't be intimidated in questioning somebody who maybe's competency is more technical than yours if you have, the systems expertise and like the business process.